I spent 7 years taking care of a woman who wasn't even my mother, and her own children only showed up twice, once for her funeral, and once for the reading of her will. My name is Claire, and I was 34 years old when my divorce from my husband, David, became final. 6 years of marriage ended quietly, without much left worth fighting over, but there was one person from that marriage I never stopped caring about, and that was David's mother, Margaret. Margaret was 71 at the time of the divorce, already dealing with health issues that had been building for years. She lived alone in a small house on the edge of town, the same house David had grown up in, and even after everything between David and me was finalized, I kept driving over every weekend with groceries, sitting with her for a few hours, listening to stories about the life she'd built in that little house. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped feeling like my mother-in-law and started feeling like the only family I still wanted to keep. David had a sister, Rachel, who lived 2 hours away with a demanding job and 3 kids of her own. Visits from either of them had already been rare before the divorce, but after it, they nearly disappeared entirely. David called every couple of weeks, brief and rushed, always ending the call before it really started. Rachel sent flowers on birthdays and holidays, always with a card that said she wished she could visit more, though the visits never actually followed. About a year after the divorce, Margaret had a bad fall in her kitchen while reaching for a pot on a high shelf. Doctors found nerve damage in her spine that had gone undiagnosed for years, worsened by the fall, and within a few months she lost most of the feeling in her legs. She needed a wheelchair, daily assistance, someone present most hours of the day, someone who could help her in and out of bed, manage her medications, and simply be there. I remember sitting in the hospital hallway when the doctor explained what her ongoing care would require. I called David first, thinking he would want to be the one to figure it out. He said he'd look into a facility nearby, that he'd get back to me soon. I called Rachel next, and she said almost the same thing, that she'd start researching options, that her schedule was just so difficult right now with the kids and work. Weeks passed, and neither of them found anything. Margaret was still in a temporary rehab facility, scared and lonely, asking me on every visit when she'd finally get to go home. So one evening, without really planning it, I told her she could come live with me instead of going into a facility, and that I would take care of her myself. She cried when I said it, gripping my hand, telling me I didn't have to do that I wasn't even her daughter-in-law anymore in any legal sense. I told her that didn't matter to me, and I meant every word of it. David seemed relieved when I told him, almost too quickly. Rachel called it such a generous thing for me to do, and promised she'd help out whenever she could. That help rarely came in any meaningful way, a phone call here, a check for groceries there, but the daily reality of it, the wheelchair transfers, the medication schedules, the long nights when her pain flared up and she couldn't sleep, all of that became mine alone to carry. I moved Margaret into my spare bedroom, the one I had originally planned to turn into an office after the divorce, and I learned things I never expected to learn: how to help someone bathe with dignity, how to track a rotation of medications without a single mistake, how to tell the difference between her being simply tired and her being in real, serious pain. Some nights were harder than I could ever explain to anyone who hadn't lived through it themselves, but most afternoons, sitting with her over tea, laughing at old photographs, I didn't feel like I was sacrificing anything. I felt like I had gained back a mother, something I had actually lost years earlier when my own mother passed away unexpectedly. 7 years passed that way, quietly, one ordinary day folding into the next. David remarried and eventually moved out of state with his new wife. Rachel's calls grew even less frequent as her own life got busier with her children's schedules and her demanding career. And more than once, sitting together in the evenings, Margaret told me I was the only person who had truly shown up for her when it actually mattered, when things were hard and unglamorous and required real sacrifice rather than a card in the mail. What I didn't know, until the day everything changed, was that Margaret had been quietly writing all of it down somewhere I never saw: every visit, every missed holiday from her own children, every year I stayed by her side without asking for anything, into a will that neither David nor Rachel would ever see coming. Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep on an otherwise ordinary morning, and I was the one who found her, sitting beside her bed with a cup of tea I never got the chance to give her that day. David and Rachel arrived within hours of each other for the funeral, dressed in black, saying all the right things to the guests about how much they loved their mother, how peaceful she looked at the end, how grateful they were that she hadn't suffered for too long. I stood near the back of the funeral home, watching people who had barely known her shake hands with her children, offering condolences, while I was the one who had actually learned every detail of her medical history, her favorite old songs, the exact way she liked her tea prepared in the afternoon. Nobody in that room knew those small, ordinary details but me. 2 weeks later, David called and asked me to come to the lawyer's office for the reading of the will. I almost didn't go, since I technically wasn't family anymore, but Margaret's lawyer had specifically requested my presence, so I showed up that morning, unsure of what to expect. The lawyer read through the document slowly, methodically. Small personal items went to Rachel, a few pieces of furniture went to David, and then came the part that made the entire room go completely silent. Margaret had left her house and the land it sat on entirely to me. David's face went pale, and Rachel immediately insisted there had to be some kind of mistake, that their mother would never do something like that to her own children. The lawyer calmly explained that Margaret had updated her will 4 years earlier, and had attached a personal letter explaining her reasoning, one she had asked to be read aloud only if her children ever questioned the decision. The lawyer opened the letter and read it aloud in front of all of us. In it, Margaret had written that for 7 years, her children had called occasionally and visited rarely, while the woman they no longer legally considered family had bathed her, fed her, and sat with her through pain no one else had ever witnessed firsthand. She wrote that a house and a piece of land could never fully repay that kind of loyalty, but it was the only tangible thing she still had left to give. Rachel started crying, though not out of grief this time, but something closer to anger, saying I had somehow manipulated an elderly, vulnerable woman for my own benefit. David stayed quiet, staring down at the floor, unable to meet my eyes across the table. I sat there for a long moment, feeling the weight of the room pressing down on me, and then I turned to the lawyer and asked if it was legally possible to formally decline an inheritance. Everyone in the room looked at me like I had lost my mind. David asked why on earth I would do that after everything I had put into those 7 years. I told him the plain truth, that I never took care of his mother in exchange for a house or a piece of land, and that if the will was going to create this much anger and permanent division inside his family, then it simply wasn't worth what she had left behind. I signed the paperwork declining the inheritance right there in the lawyer's office, and the house and land were split between David and Rachel instead. Rachel didn't offer a single word of thanks. She simply took her copy of the paperwork and left the office without looking back. David lingered near the door for a moment, told me I didn't have to do that for them, and I told him I knew, but that I wanted to anyway. Then he left too, and I walked out of that office carrying nothing but the same quiet grief I had carried in with me that morning. About a month later, a small padded envelope arrived at my house with my name written across the front in Margaret's familiar handwriting. Inside was a wooden jewelry box I recognized immediately, the one that used to sit on her dresser, along with a folded letter dated only a few weeks before she died. I sat down alone at my kitchen table and opened it carefully. Margaret had written that she suspected, knowing her own children the way only a mother could, that if there was ever a dispute over the house, I would probably give it up rather than cause a lasting fight, simply because that was who I was at my core. She wrote that she had asked her lawyer to send this envelope separately, and later, in case that happened, so that no argument over property could ever take away the one thing that had never truly been about money. Inside the box were her wedding ring, her mother's pearl earrings, and a small handwritten note that simply said these belonged to her real daughter. I was still holding that letter, turning the ring slowly in my fingers, when my phone rang. It was David, asking if I had received anything else from his mother's estate, his voice tight and edged with suspicion. Just a small box of her old jewelry, I said, closing the lid gently and setting it down on the table. Nothing that concerns you or Rachel. Are you absolutely sure that's all it was? He asked. I looked down at the ring resting quietly in my open palm, and I closed my fingers around it slowly. That's all, I said, and I hung up the phone.